Good afternoon. My name is Russell Williams. I'm the Group Program Manager of the SharePoint Team Services team. And what I want to talk to you about today is the SharePoint Team Services product. And what I'd like to go into is an introduction to the product, a little bit about what we're trying to solve with the product, and then a brief demo of what it does for those who aren't familiar with it. And then follow that with information about the architecture of SharePoint Team Services, and then a lot of detailed information on how you would deploy SharePoint Team Services in a variety of different scenarios which the product does support. So let's talk about what SharePoint Team Services is first. And what SharePoint Team Services does is what we call a team collaboration web. And a team collaboration web, what does it do for you? Well, when you're in a team, you want to share information with people. You want to have information about status, maybe announcements for the team, events and tasks, all sorts of tracking information that you want to keep track of and share with the rest of your team members. You want to share documents as well as just information, things that are published in a Word document, maybe an Excel document. You want to have some versioning and searching over those documents. You also want to get feedback on documents as a part of creating information. So you want discussion capabilities. You want to be able to review document status. You want surveys to get feedback from team members in a more focused way than just ad hoc comments. You want to know when things change and other members of your team are making changes in your team information. And so you want to get notifications and be able to subscribe to notifications about your information. And then lastly, you want to be able to have a place that is your own. You don't want to have your team portal page or your team site look like every other team site in the world. You want it to be unique with your own formatting. You might want your own custom type of tracking list or tracking information, your own custom templates, and over time even your own customized applications that run as a part of your team collaboration website. So what SharePoint Team Services provides for you is a lot of these features. SharePoint Team Services is focused on building and providing those team website features out of the box, and it's designed for teams of between 5 to a couple hundred users. We've had people use it with as many as several thousand users, but the sweet spot is in that 5 to 100 range. The product is focused on end-user value. So what that means is we have a big emphasis on ease of use and out-of-the-box usefulness so that you can install SharePoint with just a few clicks through setup and have a running server without having to understand the intricacies of NT Server or IIS or a lot of the underlying enabling technologies. Just out of the box, it will immediately work for you. It also simplifies information sharing in that it is very well integrated with the Office 10 client, so that the tools that people use to create and manage information today, such as Outlook, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, also understand deeply how to communicate and share information using team sites. And we'll demonstrate those in just a few minutes. And of course, we have rich customization, and that's using the front page tool. In previous presentations, we've demoed a little bit of that, and I'll show you a little bit in this presentation as well. But you can use front page to extensively customize all aspects of the site, look and feel, site structure, all of the content of your website, so you can truly make it your own. And an equally important part of the SharePoint product, besides ease of use, is that it is accessible. So I previously mentioned the one-click in-user setup for people to be able to deploy SharePoint on their own desktop or their own server that sits under their desk or down at the end of the hallway that's truly a workgroup server, and have it work for them. We also have self-service administration so that those users can manage their own server with very simple interfaces through a web browser, or in the case of a hosted service, maybe through an IT organization or through an ISP or an ASP, they have self-service administration that can be delegated to them, and therefore they can manage their own security and manage their own settings for appropriate settings without having to interact with a centralized IT organization or hosting organization. It's very direct and immediate. One thing I did want to mention at the beginning of this presentation is that there's some possible confusion between multiple SharePoint products that Microsoft is making this year. I'm talking to you about SharePoint Team Services. There's also a product called SharePoint Portal Server that might be known previously as the Tahoe server. And these are really complementary products, and they're named SharePoint for a reason, because they do complement each other. And the positioning and the way you use these two products is that SharePoint Team Services is all about ad hoc creation of content and collaboration. It's that team website concept that you use to create information, track that information, and communicate within your team and even outside of your team. So you're communicating your team information to other groups or other people. But notice that it's very focused on the team. It's all about intra-team and team tracking. SharePoint Portal Server, on the other hand, is all about taking information and gathering it up and searching across multiple teams. And so it has search across your entire web potentially, or multiple team sites. And in particular, it can search across multiple SharePoint team sites to give you a roll-up of information across an entire department or a division or even a company that SharePoint Team Services will not do for you. It will give you information about a team, and it will help you create that information, but it won't report across an entire department. And that's what SharePoint Portal Server will do with its cross-team searching capabilities. It also has dashboard capabilities to build a centralized reporting point for a lot of department-wide information. And it has some high-end document management capabilities that are useful in key scenarios where there's more process that needs to be put in place around documents that SharePoint Team Services itself will not support directly. So what I want to do now is demonstrate to you a brief introduction to SharePoint Team Services, what you get in terms of your home page, what you do with the list or the applications that are built into the SharePoint product, how you interact with documents and the rest of Office. So let's go to that right now. So I'm showing you here a site that has already been created, and it is a SharePoint site. You can create it in a number of ways, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. But suffice it to say, I've either installed the product or I got it from, I got a web created for me or a site created for me by IT or hosting organization. And what you see here is the home page, which has created for you out of the box navigational structure and a lot of applications that come for you pre-created with SharePoint. Things like announcements, events, maybe a list of links. You have searching, you have discussion boards, places to manage the site, other lists like contacts and tasks are all available for you up front. So let's do something like add a new announcement, and notice I'm just interacting with the browser here because that's how you're typically going to start out interacting with the site and find information about the site. So we'll just add a new announcement, and you'll notice it goes right to a web form. We'll say there's a team meeting is today, and put some text in about it, and I can even put in an expiration date for this announcement so that my web will stay current and up to date. I don't have to go back and keep manually changing or removing information. And I'll say save and close. And it immediately puts that information now right on the home page. The other information that was previously, or the other announcements that were previously in the list, just got moved down one. The similar thing can happen with almost any of the list in the SharePoint product. Let's go look at events in detail for a minute about what you can do, not just with adding announcements to the home page or adding information to the home page, but tracking information in general. And we build a number of lists for you out of the box, including events, contacts, and tasks. Let's look at the events list for an example. And you'll notice you get a tabular format, kind of like what you would see in an Excel or an Access database. And within this view, you can sort on any column just by clicking on the column headers. We have filtering, so you can decide, show me all information about events that are going to happen in Redmond, and it will filter out the ones that don't apply. You'll also notice that over here on the left side, there's a set of pre-built views, and this is very handy if you have a lot of items in a list. So right now we're looking at the All Events view, but you could just as easily go to today's events, and it filters out all the things that aren't happening on today, or things that are upcoming, and so it filters out all the events that have previously occurred. And in the case of an event list, you can get a calendar view. So you see in a calendar representation all of the various events that are happening this month. And for any one of those, just like I could in the list, I can drill down and see what information in detail is available about that event. Let's go back to the list here. And again, here you can add new events using a web-based form, just like you saw with announcements. And all of the list types that we have in SharePoint have this browser-based interface available to them. Okay, you also notice here with events that I can export this event. So if you have information on your team site that you want to put into your Outlook personal calendar, I can click on this export event, and I won't do it now, but that's an example of the way that SharePoint interacts with the Office applications. For exporting events, I can do the same thing with contacts, and I can import information into the SharePoint site from Outlook, such as contacts. So let's go and look at documents, which is, in addition to just tracking information, documents are a key part of what most teams do to collaborate and produce and create information. And you'll notice that there's a place on the top navigation bar for SharePoint called Documents. And I can have a number of different document libraries, which are just gathering points for groups of related documents. And we create one for you by default called Shared Documents, but I can have any number of documents as a part of my SharePoint Team Services site. So let's go into Shared Documents. And you'll see here that I have a number of documents placed into this document library. I have a search box, so I can search over all of the content in this document library and scope specifically this document library. And on any one of these items, I can click on it, and it takes me right to the document content. And so it's a very easy way to go find and organize information. And if you've ever published information to the web, instead of having to manually create web pages and link in all of the information and documents by hand, the act of simply publishing to this document library causes a link to automatically appear and that document to be available to everybody. And there are a number of properties that I can see here in the document library view, such as when it was modified and by who. And I can do all of my usual filtering and sorting that you can in any of the other lists. One interesting thing to note is that there's an extra column here on this document library called Review Status. And this is a column that I added by hand. By default, document libraries don't have that Review Status column. But like any other list in the SharePoint Team Services site, I can customize it. And I can add my own columns of data if I want to do so. In this case, I wanted to have a Review Status column. And so if I go and edit this particular document and I wanted to change its review status to, let's say it's now approved instead of submitted, this field here has an arbitrary number of choices that I can control as the site administrator, and then I can use that to track information about those documents or any item on the site for that matter. But let's go through the process of how you would create a new document, and I'll show you how the Team Services site is integrated with Office and how it simplifies the publishing process. And so you'll notice here on the top there's a New Document button. And when I click on that button, what happens is there is a template that has been associated with this SharePoint document library. And as an administrator, someone set this template up for me. But by having this template, it's very easy to get content created automatically. I can have fields filled in automatically, and I can enforce a consistent look and feel for all of the documents in a given site. And so I'll go ahead and put in a trip report, which is what this template is about. And we can say the trip will be, and then any kind of content that I want. And this template process works for any of the Office application editors. So we're using Word here. We could just as usually be using Excel or PowerPoint. And so I'll say Save As. And when I do so, you'll note that in the Save dialog now, I've gone directly back to the website. So I do not have to understand, as a user of the website, all the intricacies of where to point my Word to publish this document back up to the website. It just knows by default because I started from the website to begin with using that New Document button. You'll also notice that in the presentation in my File Save dialog, I'm seeing a view of the website itself. And so this is not just the kind of confusing, complicated file and folder view of most websites, but it's actually a view of the document library similar to what I got in the browser. And so I'll go ahead and type in a title here and a file name, just like I would with any other type of document. Hit the Save button. And then one other thing comes up, and because we added that property that I showed you previously that tracks the review status of documents, and this is a property that I explicitly added by hand, well, it's now asking me for the value of that property when I save the document. And so it prompts users to enter it for me. I don't have to go back as an administrator and continually keep this information up to date. And so I'll say this document is submitted. It's not yet ready for prime time. The document gets saved up to the website. And now when I go back over to the website, I see the document I just created automatically appearing and linked in. Some other ways to use document libraries include uploading documents. If you don't want to use the Office applications, you can use browser-based upload, and this also might be the case if you're on the road and may not have the most current version of the Office client available to you. You can upload any arbitrary document through a browser right to the website. And for notification of when things change, I have a subscribe button, and so I can go into the subscription dialog, get a notification for shared documents in this case, or for that matter, any list that's available on the SharePoint Team Services site. And I can be notified when anything changes or when particular things change or added or removed from the site. And I just type in an email address to send a piece of mail to either once a day or once a week as a roll-up, or I can even get it instantly whenever a change occurs, although sometimes that'll tend to spam your inbox. So we have the rollout capabilities by default. Okay, so we've looked at list, we've looked at documents. Let's look at how you create information that's not just something that's canned or out of the box, like the contacts list or the events list that we've been looking at. You want to have some custom information that's unique to your team or your work group. And you can use any of the templates to create lists that we build by default for you, such as creating a new contact list or a new discussion board. You can even create surveys. We haven't gone into that, but that's a way you would create an arbitrary survey and send it out to your work group. Or you can import information from a spreadsheet. And that's what we'll do here. Let's see, we want a list, and I have a spreadsheet called Team Assignments, and it's assigning team members to particular breakout groups at an offsite event that we're putting together for planning purposes. And I go pick the source spreadsheet. Yep, let's see, where'd it go? Right here, team meeting assignments. And say, do I want to have this list that gets imported from Excel appear on my quick launch bar, which is that list of links that appears on my homepage? And I'll say yes. That's a great way to have new information in the site automatically link into the rest of the site. And what we do is Excel will come up and ask me where the list information exists in my Excel spreadsheet. And so I'll select that list of people in this case, or any information that I want to import into my website. Hit the import button, and this information will get rolled up and communicated back to the web server using HTTP and XML. And so now I see a new list that's been created for me, built into my website with all of that information that was in the Excel spreadsheet. And like any other list, I can sort on it. I can filter, so I can turn off particular areas if I don't want to see. I want to see just the people in the competition group, I can do so. Just like any other list on the site, I can subscribe to it. I can even export this information back out to Excel. And so this is a very powerful feature to be able to track arbitrary data in your collaboration website. And if we go back to the home page, you'll notice that now there's a new link here called Team Assignment that appeared in our quick launch bar because we checked that option saying yes, automatically link it into the rest of my website. The last thing I want to show you briefly is how you customize these collaboration sites. So this is a reasonable look and feel, and it's very easy because it just sets up out of the box. But I want to add my own logo. I might want to change the way the navigational structure of this site is built. I might even want to apply a new theme, change the look and feel, the colors, the fonts, and so on. And I can do all that using FrontPage. So you'll notice that the Edit with FrontPage button is available and enabled on the IE toolbar. When I click on it, the homepage of my website comes up, and you'll see that over here on the left side, in the FrontPage 10 product, I'm seeing all the information that's in my website or in my team collaboration site. And it is a front page web, just like any other front page web that you would publish on the internet, except it has extra capabilities like document libraries and editing lists. So on my homepage, I can do things like change this graphic over to a graphic that I want. So let's see. Let's make this be a particular logo like that. I can change the title here. I can change any of the themes and color schemes. I can even click on the lists themselves, and we haven't demonstrated this, but the list can be edited in the browser. They can also be edited in FrontPage. So if I double click on a given list, I get a properties dialog, which lets me change what list is displayed, what fields are displayed, what sort and filter is displayed. And so many of these options are available in the browser for a very simple point-and-click kind of interface, or I can get advanced options here in FrontPage that allow me to do advanced formatting using a template gallery of different formatting types, and of course choices of fields and so forth that I can't do in the browser. So we'll save this page into the site and go back over to my web page. And you'll notice now my updates are appearing as a part of my team site. And I can take this to pretty much any level that I want to do. We've had people create themes and looks for SharePoint team sites that look like the Starship Enterprise control panel, or they can look as simple as the site that you see out of the box. Okay, that's it for the demo. There's a lot more information and depth to this product than just the parts that I've showed you, so I'd encourage you to give it a try. But we need to go on and look at some of the architectural design of SharePoint and also how you would deploy it in a number of different scenarios. So let's look at the SharePoint architecture. And this will be very brief and high level, but it's going to give you a feel for how SharePoint is built and how it works. And this will lead us to some of the deployment issues and how you would deploy SharePoint because of the various technologies that we use to build the SharePoint product. And so what you see here is a very rough block diagram of the SharePoint product. Everything about SharePoint lives behind your web server. And so in this case, that's IIS, either under Windows 2000 or Windows Whistler, when Whistler is released. And so all the communication with the SharePoint server goes through HTTP protocols, which means it's a internet-enabled, internet-ready product from the very beginning. It can either be used on an intranet, inside a firewall, or outside a firewall. It doesn't matter because all of the communication, including the authoring as well as the browsing, goes through HTTP. On the right side, in the green box, you'll see that one of the three major components of the SharePoint product. And this one is about authoring and web management. And that's very similar and, in fact, uses the same sets of code as the front page server extensions are used for front page webs and managing front page webs and front page content. And that's where we get a lot of the features for publishing documents, for applying themes, for collecting usage analysis statistics on your web and reporting on that information, for managing broken links, for managing navigational structure of a site. All of that is carried out using this code from the front page server extensions, and that enables us to use the front page product as our editing tool. All of that information, and so all of the documents that you create as part of your team collaboration site are stored on the file system of the web server. And that contains the document content as well as metadata about those documents for things like link information or property information that we then will display and filter on. In the middle is what most people think of as the core of the SharePoint product, and that is the list management and editing and rendering code. And that's what the lists that we build out of the box, such as surveys and task lists and the contact lists, are built upon. And that code manages all of the columns of information. It displays them in HTML. It manages the backend database to store the list information. It manages the update process. It also manages the document library, which is something of a hybrid between traditional web authoring and web publishing and the list, show it in HTML, make it easy to update through your browser concepts of the SharePoint site. And so the SharePoint list infrastructure stores this information using SQL Server, and there are various flavors of SQL Server that we'll talk about in detail a little later to keep things like the list information, discussion information, which we didn't demonstrate, but we have interactive team discussions, subscriptions, and all the document properties that you see in the document library view. And then lastly, on the left side is the discussions and subscriptions capabilities, and that manages a list of subscriptions for every user to particular lists or particular documents within the website. And then when those documents or lists are changed or updated, it will send notification emails to the people who have subscribed using any SMTP server. And that can be Exchange, or it could even be a Unix-based email system. It really doesn't matter, since SMTP is sort of the universal email transport for most internet providers. So we've looked at the components in terms of the technologies used. Let's look a little bit at what the team site architecture is about, how the team site is represented and managed. And the way that works is that every SharePoint team site is a front page web, which lets us get consistent navigation, theming, management using the front page client, just like I could with a front page web that's published on a non-SharePoint site. Further, we extend the front page web with having each list, or the things like the contact list or the task list, also be represented by a web page. And that makes it very easy for us to edit those lists using the front page tool, because every list appears as a page in the front page view. I can double click on it and immediately I'm editing properties for that list or editing the look and feel of that list. So the lists themselves are dynamic information, and that's different from a front page web. That's a new capability that is unique to SharePoint. And so they're rendered from a database of information into HTML on the fly when you fetch that page, as opposed to just being a static page that's edited once and saved and then served up any number of times. So the information about the list, the schema in terms of the number or the type and the number of columns that appear, the names of the columns, is all represented and described in XML. inside of the SharePoint architecture. We use that description to be able to manage these lists and update them through our browser capabilities or through the front page product to change them to be exactly what you need. All of the list data itself, or the information that consists of or makes up each row of a list, is stored in SQL Server tables, and those tables are automatically managed by the SharePoint system based on the XML schema description so that they will store the correct rows and columns of information. All of the areas of the list themselves, like I said, are dynamic, so that those are built by and rendered on the fly by querying the SQL Server with the right query that we construct based on that XML schema description, turning them into HTML, and then inserting them into the page in the proper place to show the list information. And that proper place is denoted by a special piece of markup called a front page bot. And this will be familiar to people who are familiar with the front page product. And that front page bot lets front page recognize that this is a unique area of HTML that's going to come out and be generated on the fly. And it should be treated as a special construct in and of itself, so that when I double click on it, I'm not going to go and edit the individual words. I'm going to edit properties for a list, such as what columns to display or what lists to display, as opposed to just editing a table in place like a static document would edit. So that's a brief introduction to the architecture. Let's talk more about the deployment information. How I get SharePoint and what platforms it runs on, some of the deployment scenarios. And this is really the meat of what you should take away from this presentation, is how I should typically deploy SharePoint. And then based on the deployment scenario that you choose, what are the issues that you're going to have with SQL Server, which for many scenarios you'll never see and is automatically managed for you by the SharePoint product. But in certain scenarios, such as an IT or a hosted scenario, you do care about what the SQL Server is, where it lives, and how it's hosted. How security is managed using front page, using SharePoint, how administration is done using SharePoint, and then a little bit about scalability guidelines for what kind of hardware and how you should deploy SharePoint. So first is distribution. And there's basically two ways to get the SharePoint product. One is if you are hosting it yourself. So that means you're providing the hardware, you're providing the operations and the network tap, and you want to be able to completely control everything about that box. The two primary ways to get it there are through Front Page 10, which will be the next version of the Front Page product, or any Office 10 SKU. There are several of them that include the Front Page product as a part of the Office bundle. There's also, SharePoint will also be distributed not just through Front Page, but in the future when Windows Whistler Server and Advanced Server ship, SharePoint will be included as a part of Windows Server and Advanced Server, so that as soon as I install Whistler, I can choose through the Configure Your Server wizard to add on SharePoint capabilities immediately without having to go and get a separate product. Or the second way to install it, if you don't want to put up with the hassle of getting your own server, setting it up, running it on an ongoing basis, SharePoint is also designed to be a hostable product. And so it could be hosted internally in an IT infrastructure, but we're also setting up relationships with a number of external internet service providers or application service providers to provide SharePoint product or SharePoint hosting service to anybody over the internet. Some of these vendors include Verio and a company called AIT, which are major players in the internet hosting space today, and there'll be more in the future, and pretty much any internet service provider can provide SharePoint service to their customers, and that's a very convenient option for trial purposes or for deployment scenarios where you don't want to have a lot of IT investment. Either you don't have an IT department, or it's an extranet type of scenario. It doesn't want to interact or need to interact with the internal resources of your intranet. What are the platforms that SharePoint can use? So for production use, that is, full-scale deployment, the SharePoint product should be deployed on either Windows 2000 Server or Advanced Server, or the Whistler Server or Advanced Server. You can also deploy and use SharePoint on Windows 2000 Professional and Whistler Professional, but those are really for evaluation and demo purposes, because the underlying platforms themselves are not as well optimized for being a server, and they have licensing restrictions that will make it difficult to actually use the SharePoint product in a full-scale departmental environment, whereas the server products are designed for that. And one word on Whistler, the product will be available in the Whistler box, but due to ongoing changes in the way that the Whistler web support works, and the fact that it hasn't shipped yet, I would advise waiting for Whistler Beta 2 before you use SharePoint with Whistler. So use the SharePoint bits that are included in the Whistler Beta 2 CD if you want to try SharePoint on the Whistler platform. So what are the deployment scenarios for SharePoint? And there's two basic models for how you would use the SharePoint product. The first one is what we call the workgroup server model, and that's where you have a person who wants to have SharePoint. They put it on their desktop machine and use it as a server. They could potentially even put it on a machine that's down at the end of the hallway or sitting under their desk and set it up for their workgroup or their department. The other model is a hosted or an IT managed model, and that's where you would have a professional organization providing SharePoint services for other groups to use. And there are various things to consider between these two models, which we'll go into detail in just a second. Things such as the scale of how many sites are used on a particular box or hosted on a particular box, how they're managed, in that these two scenarios have very different management requirements, and then how the security is managed between these two scenarios. So let's talk first about the workgroup server scenario. And in that case, what we're going to have is something like a site for my team or my group that I want to be set up very simply on a desktop server or an under the desk, into the hallway type of server. And SharePoint supports this by having a one-click setup, and it supports automatically creating the basic team site on the root of your server. And that just happens out of the box during the setup process with no extra work. And in that case, you would just end up with a site called HTTP My Group or whatever the name of the machine is. And those machines can also have subgroups. So you can have things for particular projects. You could have your own SharePoint subsite, or particular teams within your department, say, you could have your own SharePoint subsite. And those can be created very easily, and they can also be destroyed very easily using the SharePoint administration tools or using the front page client. And so in the workgroup server scenario, you're also looking at probably lower end hardware than you would in a hosted scenario, because it just simply doesn't need as many resources. It'll have less content stored on the server and less users hitting the server. So what are the security guidelines for this type of server? SharePoint gives you a number of options to work with, depending on what kind of infrastructure you're going to have around you when you set up a workgroup server. One is to create local accounts through the web UI that SharePoint provides for managing security. And this is the simplest option, and it's kind of a standalone option that assumes that you don't have any other infrastructure around you, no NT domain. That might be appropriate for a dedicated box that's hosted on the internet, might be appropriate for a small network that doesn't have an NT domain server. Or if they're in a corporation, if they're in an NT domain structure, they can use NT domain accounts to manage security, or they could use both. And that might be the case in an extranet scenario where you have an NT domain that you want to use accounts for internal users to access the site, but you also want to be able to create accounts very easily for external vendors to come in and access your SharePoint site without having to go through the process of creating them an NT domain account on your internal network. You may not want to for reasons of security. And SharePoint will let you create an account for that vendor just on the SharePoint site, and it can be isolated in that way. So we've talked about a couple of the characteristics of this model, such as people who are individual end users installing the product. They probably have a low tolerance for ongoing administration, and so that's where the one-click setup and the self-service administration capabilities of SharePoint are very useful, in that it's a web-based administration tool. It just appears in your browser, integrated in as a part of the site through links to the administration tools. It's very simple to access. Standalone SharePoint also supports a simple install process by auto-installing a database for you. And that database that we install is MSDE, and I'll get to a little more detail about that in a couple of slides. But what that does for you is it makes it so that the person who is probably not a server administrator type, who just wants to get the SharePoint collaboration capabilities, doesn't have to understand the details of how to set up a SQL server or how to set up any type of database. We will do that for them on behalf of the SharePoint setup. So the other model, besides the workgroup server model, is the hosted or IT service model. And this is the one where you get a lot more scale, and people are probably paying you for it as opposed to just setting it up on their local machine or their local hallway. The characteristics here: you have centralized operation and a centralized installation. You have a higher scale with many sites hosted on the same set of hardware. So that's where you get the concept of virtual servers. There can be several hundred of them all sharing the same hardware, and all operating independently of each other, but making shared use of that CPU and that network tab. You also get the capability to do controlled backups because it's in a centralized installation and has centralized operations, and controllable administration. And I say controllable because there are certain things that SharePoint offers a centralized operator that lets them either control all of the administration themselves, or they can delegate certain aspects of the administration out to the site owners. For example, security is a thing that is typically delegated because it's an ongoing process for each team site to add and remove users as the teams evolve. People come and go. They might need to add a new member from outside of the group. All of that low-level traffic of continually adding and managing users could be something that the IT organization wants to control themselves, or they could just say, this one person that owns that team site in that one team can set security for this one team site. And the SharePoint product supports that using delegated self-service administration. We also support isolation between sites, and this supports that concept of multiple virtual servers on the same physical hardware. And by isolation, that means that on team site A and team site B that's sharing the same hardware, they don't share the same set of users, they can't see each other's users, they can't see each other's content, and they can't manage each other's information without having specific rights to the other person's information. Only the box administrator, or the person who sets up and manages the box, can see all of the sites. Each site owner can only see the site that they own or belong to. We have scriptable setup for centralized deployment and installation of the SharePoint product across a number of different machines in a data center environment. We have command line tools for automation of administration processes in a data center environment. And then there are flexible ways that you can set up the actual content and how you manage handing out different team sites to on a shared environment. So the details of that and how I hand out the sites to particular users are that there are a couple different models. One is I can have isolated virtual servers on the same box, and this is probably the simplest scenario, and is a case where a lot of teams will want this, but it's relatively costly in terms of machine resources and administration overhead. So in a lot of cases this is appropriate. In some cases it may not be. The other option is listed below, and we'll get to that in a second. But that's where you would get a site or a team name or a site name for each site that's something like myteam.com or myteam, and each one is a separate top-level element of a URL. And that can be true for both intranet sites and also internet sites. Within each one of those sites, I can also have multiple subwebs, like we talked about in the workgroup server scenario. So I can still add a project 1 subweb under team 1 and a project 2 subweb under team 2, and they operate independently of each other. And these subwebs aren't aware of any other subwebs other than their parent, and so they're isolated by the virtual server. If I don't want to manage virtual servers and hand those out to users of my SharePoint hosting service, I can also choose to manage handing out SharePoint sites on a subweb basis. And so that would be the example that I listed at the bottom of this slide, which is I have a single server, maybe called SharePoint Server, that is managed by my hosting service. And then each team gets their own subweb under that. So their URL to their team site looks like SharePoint Server / Team3 or My Team. And there can be any number of these subwebs. And each subweb can have its own unique set of permissions and can be managed independently. So this is a cheaper way of achieving multiple teams sharing the same box. It doesn't have to go through some of the overhead of the multiple virtual server case. For example, setting up different IP addresses or different DNS entries for each individual team. But there are trade-offs here because in this subweb hosting scenario, there are some aspects of managing SharePoint that are more difficult, and it's also an uglier URL. And some teams just may not want that long URL. They might want their own sort of vanity nameplate for their team site. And so that's a choice that whatever the hosting organization is, they have to make that choice about how they want to deploy SharePoint. So those are the two basic deployment models. What does that mean for SQL Server? A SQL Server is what we use to store the actual information that's in lists, and it's required for every SharePoint site. And so the two basic deployment models treat SQL Server differently. In the standalone deployment model or the workgroup deployment model, the SharePoint setup will automatically install MSDE. And in this case, we'll automatically install it, we'll configure it, we'll set up the administration for it. And so the user or the person who installs the SharePoint server doesn't even know necessarily that MSDE is there or is a part of the product. It just happens for them. And that's great for simplicity, but it does mean that administration tools are built in and covered by the SharePoint product, and that means that while we think we have enough administration tools in terms of backup, they're very simple and simplistic as compared to the full set of SQL tools. So there's a trade-off there. Another important, or the key trade-off, is that when you're using MSDE, it's very appropriate for a workgroup level server where there's one site with multiple subwebs perhaps serving a relatively small number of users. But that MSDE product or that MSDE database engine will not scale up to the level of scale that you need to support many sites in a hosted environment. There are built-in limits in the MSDE product to prevent that from occurring because it's free as compared to the SQL Server, full SQL Server product. And so if you do want to go with a hosted deployment scenario where there are multiple sites sharing the same hardware, or if you want to get the full flexibility of SQL tools to manage the SQL Server, then you need to use either full SQL 7 or SQL 2000 as your database backend. And that entails purchasing and installing the SQL Server product separately from the SharePoint product. And when you install SharePoint, instead of letting it automatically install MSDE, instead you point it explicitly at the SQL Server that you want it to use. So each virtual server in this scenario will get its own SQL Server database, and we'll create those databases for you, but you have to tell us where the SQL Server is to use. And then from then on, we'll take care of the rest. Also, one other option to keep in mind is that the SQL Server can be deployed either on the same box as the web server that's running the SharePoint software, or it can be on a remote box. It doesn't matter to the SharePoint product functionality. They work the same in either case. But the advantages of having it on a remote box are perhaps better utilization of memory or hardware resources, or fitting into an existing IT organization's structure for managing SQL servers that might be distinct from web servers. And you could also potentially consolidate multiple SQL servers, or correction, you could have one SQL server that manages the SQL databases for multiple web servers, so that you can have one high-end SQL Server box serving the databases for a number of perhaps lower-end hardware web server boxes. SharePoint will work in that environment. Another aspect to consider when you're deploying is security and how you manage that. So for user management, which is one aspect of security, and this is the thing that site owners will see most often, the way it works with SharePoint is that security authentication is based on NT accounts. So every user of a SharePoint site needs to have an NT account created for them one way or another. So how do you do that? You add and remove accounts from a SharePoint site using the web-based front-end tools, and that's the self-service administration that can be delegated to a site owner to manage their own security, or it can be through command line tools. So that might be the case if you have automated processes that want to update security using some other existing directory structure or database structure. And in the corporate scenario, the way you would manage these NT accounts that are required for SharePoint authentication is you would use probably domain accounts. So SharePoint does support domain accounts. You can also use domain groups, and in that way you can avoid having to add and remove individual users, and you can leverage domain groups that are set up in a directory structure. So for example, if your departments always have a domain group created for them, simply add the domain group to the SharePoint permissions list, and then any updates to that group in the directory are automatically reflected in the SharePoint permissions. You don't have to explicitly add every single individual user by hand whenever they're added to the group. In a standalone scenario where I don't have a domain structure, or I might not want a domain structure, SharePoint will automatically create and remove accounts on the local box. So they'll create local NT accounts using those web-based or command line front-end tools to manage the SharePoint permissions. And in that way, someone who's running a standalone isolated box really doesn't have to understand the complexities of the NT domain environment. They can simply use this web-based front-end to manage their permissions directly. So once I have an account, once I have a logon, how do I decide what you can do in a SharePoint site? And SharePoint supports that and assigns what users can do based on what we call roles. And there are a number of roles that are predefined as a part of the SharePoint product that come with a new web out of the box, including things like browser, or people who can just look at the site, can't change anything, people who are, I don't have it listed on the slide, but people who can update list information, like they could add a new contact, but they couldn't save a document. Then there are people who are authors who can do all of the above. They can browse, they can update list information, they can also save documents. There are people who can do all of that, and they can make changes to the site structure. So they could perhaps apply a new theme or change some of the navigational structure of the website. And then lastly, there's the site administrator, who's the person who can do all of the content management, and they can also manage security and settings for the website itself. And also listed as a role that is not on this slide but is available in SharePoint is the role of the box administrator. And in a standalone workgroup deployment of SharePoint, that person and the site administrator are probably the same person. But in the case of a hosted or an IT-hosted SharePoint deployment, the site administrator is the person who owns one particular site. The box administrator is the person who owns the box and therefore has access to all of the sites that are hosted on that box. So the roles that are included in SharePoint are customizable. And not only the list of roles and the titles of the roles are customizable, but I can change what each individual role can do. And that's done by assigning different rights, such as in the author role, if I decide I really don't want authors to be able to delete documents, for example, that is a right that I can turn off and disable for authors, and then all of the authors lose that capability. And by using this customization, I can tailor the roles exactly to my requirements or to your requirements for any given scenario to limit access or grant access. So related to roles is administration, and we've talked a lot about delegated site administration, and the site manager is the one who's going to use that the most. So by default, all site security settings are delegated to site managers, but that's something that can be controlled by the box owner. And so that box owner, using the global administration capabilities of the SharePoint product, can decide, I will allow certain capabilities to be delegated, or I will not allow capabilities to be delegated to site owners. And that's done by disabling certain rights at a global basis. So they could decide the ability to set security permissions or to add new users is globally disabled. And that means all site administrators would suddenly lose access to that capability. Therefore, it would be reserved to the box administrator. The box administrator also has tools available to them to manage multiple sites that are running on the same box, such as what we call provisioning a new virtual server. That is, a new team wants a new virtual server. They come to the central IT organization and say, I want this, please set it up for me. That would be where the box owner uses the SharePoint global administration to go create the new virtual server, create all of the necessary network information like the DNS entry or the IP address, and then tell SharePoint, here's a new virtual server, please create a new team site on it. And that's the process called provisioning. We talked a little bit about the global policies that let people control the amount of delegation, and there's certain quotas that can be set on each individual site by the global administrator. For example, a quota on the number of users that you can add to any given site is available. So that way, in a hosted scenario, say in an ISP or an ASP, you could differentiate different product offerings by saying package A has a quota of 5 users that can be added to the site. Package B, which might cost more, allows you to add 25 users to the site. And so these capabilities are built into the SharePoint global administration pages. So let's talk a little bit about scalability guidelines. And obviously the scalability, or the guidelines that we'll choose and recommend are different for different sets of hardware and the deployment scenario that you're interested in. And so what we're talking about here, or what I'm going to discuss, is a hosted scenario with mid-range hardware. So it's not the most expensive, super-duper web box that I could possibly come up with, but it's a case where I have mid-range hardware, probably a dual proc Pentium, fairly high-end with a gigabyte of memory. In that situation, I can usually deploy 500 virtual servers on a single web box, and each one of those virtual servers can in turn have multiple subwebs, and they have any number of users that are assigned to those virtual servers. So unlike some other Microsoft products, such as Exchange, that is very easy or easier to predict and set up scalability based on the number of users who are using that server, in the case of SharePoint, we measure the scalability more around the number of sites. Because it's a web-based product that is stateless, it's very difficult to measure the number of users because their connections come and go in a stateless environment. So some of the variables to consider with scalability are the load mix between document authoring versus browsing. Browsing is going to be a lighter load than authoring will. Therefore, if you have a lot of authors or you anticipate a lot of authoring activity as compared to simply browsing it, you would probably want to decrease the number of virtual servers that are using a particular box. The size of the web makes an impact. So the larger the web, potentially the slower the system will be. You won't see this on one web necessarily until it gets extremely large. But when you add up a number of webs together, if you have many extremely large webs on one server, you might want to consider either segmenting those webs up into multiple subwebs or distributing them across different physical servers. The number of subwebs does have an impact as well, because each subweb, although it's lighter weight than a virtual server, does use some amount of server resources. And generally what we'd recommend is that we're in the final stages of creating some white papers that will describe the scalability guidelines for the different hosting scenarios that we've talked about. The commercial hosting scenario where it's hosted with multiple virtual servers, and also the departmental standalone deployment scenario for the SharePoint product. So some other resources that would be interesting to you to find out about SharePoint are the SharePoint Administrator's Guide, which is included as a part of the Office Resource Kit, and that's the Office 10 Resource Kit. The white papers that I mentioned are in progress, and those will be published on Microsoft.com site as well as other sites when they're available. There's a web hosting provider program for partners who are web hosting web presence providers. This is the same program that's used for the front page server extensions. We're extending it to include SharePoint as well. So if you have a web hosting provider that wants to host SharePoint, you should definitely hook them up with this program, which is administered here by Microsoft. And then lastly, there's developers information, because the SharePoint product can be customized not just in the way that we've been talking about in terms of in-user customization. You could actually perform customizations that apply to the default template that gets created by default. Let's say that in a particular company, if they wanted to put their own logo at the top of every SharePoint site, they can do so by customizing the default template. Or you could provide new list templates if you wanted to have a standardized list template, or augment the templates that we provide with a new column that appears in every website. All of these things are possible using some of the information that we're describing in the developers kit about the XML schema that's used to describe SharePoint sites, and about the protocols that are used to communicate with SharePoint sites. So thank you very much. That's the end of the presentation.